Welcome back from the break. We're here for the final session. Let me first mention that the continuing education code that some people were asking for is 581, and we'll have one more at the end of the program today, so 581. For this last panel discussion, we have all the speakers from today together to reflect on what you've each heard today, and maybe we'll start with each of you have a chance to share what sort of stands out as you've listened to one another and thought about these issues throughout the day, and we'll have some interaction that way, and then we'll take some more questions after we've interacted together a bit. So whoever wants to start.
Karen, thanks for volunteering.
This is the dangers of knowing someone for too long. Sibling relationship, well, I'll get you back later. We were just commenting as we sat down for this final panel at how full our cups are. And so the process of being a part of this collective today has just left me feeling very, very just fulfilled and content, and I feel like I've had a big meal, and I'm still digesting. I think one of the takeaways for me from today is just how much of an intersection there is between a lot of our work. For some of the folks here on this panel, I have not met or worked with, and yet the language through which they're speaking and their ideas just resonate so deeply and have really given me a lot of pause and a lot of added more curiosity. So I have a lot more questions. One of the takeaways for me is this. I don't know if it's a takeaway or a challenge, is the way in which we navigate the various parts of human existence, from the interpersonal to the intrapersonal to the group level to the systemic level, and it feels really daunting at times, like which branch to shake first. And so I think that's where I'm sort of sitting right now is, okay, where do I want to enter into these sort of new conversations? I've been thinking a lot about the early conversation around trauma and full regard, how to be fully known and fully seen, and how to also hold one's life story and trauma as something not to be hidden but to be talked about, and all of that stuff. So I'm going to stop because I'm rambling now, and I'm going to have some tea. Okay.
Thanks, Karen.
I can follow. I guess I just want to say that it's been professionally and personally very rich. So I want to lift up a couple things because Karen is right next to me. The invitation to practice which position you're in when certain things are said in institutional spaces, to reflect on which role you're in. And it just really struck me, practice means you're not going to be good at it at the beginning. And in many of our spaces, I mean, I can speak for my context, just such a need to be an expert, such a need to already know things, and just the invitation to get things wrong feels so countercultural, or an unlearning. That's part of the unlearning that was also talked about. So that really struck me, and that the invitation to practice may not be a big intervention, but a small incremental, making small incremental changes. Just on a more personal level, I did experience a sense of grieving that I spent so much time in my early youth in spaces that did not foster self-compassion. So that conversation around, I think it was brought up in David's presentation, which is like the negative self-talk. Where did I learn this? A lot of it I learned in religious spaces. So just opening up, I think, a sense of grief. And often, as a classroom teacher of people going into ministry, I hold that space of grieving, I think, for some of the students who come with that very negative self-talk. So I found that just really a challenge of what kinds of messages are we speaking in the spaces that should be the most compassionate and affirming. What's going on there? So just found myself just appreciative, but also reflecting on my own experience as a teacher, as a young girl in religious spaces. All of that was going on. So thank you.
Thank you, Shelley.
I guess I can jump in. I think the couple of takeaways for me was what Karen was talking about unlearning. I think we talk a lot about learning, and just trying to think through. Like that got me to ponder a little bit more about what have I learned that I need to unlearn, and that blind spot is. I don't know. It's an interesting kind of frame to think about education through a model of unlearning and then relearning. I also thought the definition that Steve shared about humility and about really being grounded and it really being a part of just a centering force, I thought that was a fresh reminder especially for even from somebody who studies cultural humility quite a bit, to see new definitions and to see different ways of thinking about that term.
For me, I was reflecting on how a lot of our conversations about navigating, intercultural spaces, how that might play out if we were to look at, religion through a cultural lens, so thinking of intercultural spaces through the lens of perhaps interreligious spaces, and just, first and foremost to name that pretty much everything I talked about in my presentation was, specifically normed from a Christian perspective, and how important it will be for us to do research and to expand learning on how some of these dynamics might be in play within the context of other religious traditions. And I also think of, when I think of microaggressions as well as macroaggressions between different racial groups, I think there's also a lot to be said about how many Christians here in America have aggressed towards other religious groups as well, and the importance of each of us in our own tradition to engage in this work to address these problems in our own back door, in our own backyard. That's part of how what I'm reflecting on right now.
I will go next. One of the things that really stood out to me, and I agree, Karen, there's so many things on my mind, and I feel like my brain is a little bit of a mush right now, but one theme that I just wanted to highlight that I felt like I kept hearing over and over again is this wish for a sense of belonging, that whether we're talking about an interpersonal space where there's a rupture and we want to repair it, or there's a communal space. And I was thinking about recently, Judith Herman has been writing a book on truth and repair and restorative justice. And one of the things that she highlights in this new piece is the concept of the moral community, and a community that stands alongside the person or the people who are suffering or who have been traumatized. And so she conducted all these different interviews with survivors of complex, severe traumas, and asked them about forgiveness. And one of the things that many of the survivors talked about is that they just wanted validation. They wanted other people who they loved and respected to witness, as you were talking about, that position of witnessing, to acknowledge, validate what had happened and believe them. And and that became the foundation of this idea of the moral community. And one of the things that came to me when you were speaking, Dave, is the ability to engage in critical thinking is actually a part of developing that moral community, right? So in a religious class, can you ask questions that actually challenge this this impulse to just just go along with whatever the party line is, or the dominant way of thinking is, and can you actually challenge that and still belong? Right, and so it made me think a great deal about that. So,
I too have been really thinking about so many things today, but I guess one that is really clear to me is the multifaceted nature of trauma and the way, and that's been such a theme, the way trauma estranges us from one another and creates divisions, and then the ways sometimes we might choose to try to cope with it also creates more divisions. And then exposure by those of us who try to work with people who've been traumatized has its own set of risks. And there's, at one level, all of that seems like stuff I know, but I think by listening to different angles on it through the day, I'm sort of struck, and it's easy to use a word like systemic this, but I'm really struck by the interrelated nature of that whole dynamic among those who've been traumatized, those trying to help those who are traumatized, those who set up systems of communities that seem to be helping but maybe do more damage. And I guess why it seems like we do need a kind of interdisciplinary set of lenses to not just be working on one small slice of it. That's what I'm sitting with.
I recently heard of a definition of trauma from actually someone in this room. And that definition of trauma is that trauma is what happens when intense emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it could be held. Mm-hmm. And I think perhaps on a high level, what a lot of us are talking about today, and perhaps part of the purpose of today is, the question of, well, can our religious community be that relational home for the many forms of emotional hurt that we're experiencing? And unfortunately, the reality is that many of them are not, cannot. But I think it's the fundamental conviction of all of us here that, well, we can, and we should, and we'd like to take steps towards that direction.
I guess I'll just speak into that because of the power of the concept of home and how complicated it is when you're displaced from your home. But all of our sacred traditions and stories, it's a major theme of journeying away from home, finding home again, the parable of the prodigal father. I call it the parable of the prodigal father in Christian scriptures. I mean, it's a story about leaving home and a parent longing for the child to come home. And that resonance across these stories are very powerful because they reflect what Thurman would say is the hunger of the heart, the hunger in the heart to find. And the themes are very, what we would call simple, but then, psychological texture, historical texture, theological texture, but, find that story about being called home. And I feel like those stories resonate, right? All of us were kind of telling stories about, the place is not a home, or the home is complicated. Home has betrayed your trust. but the longing to kind of find a home or be part of a community again. So just reminded of many of our traditions tell that story different ways, but it's shared often across traditions.
It's sort of, I love that idea of using our historical narratives and how much that they sort of center this idea of belonging and home. And this reminds me, so my kids are 9 and 12, and we read a lot of Harry Potter. And Harry Potter is such a great set of books to really talk about this idea. And I do think we need to start really young. And how do we use stories for children to start cultivating this idea of what does it mean to feel loved? What does it mean to feel like a sense of belonging? Because as many of you read Harry Potter, he lives under the stairs and he's abused, he's neglected, and these are his relatives that he's living with, and they treat him horribly. And it isn't until he enters Hogwarts where he finds a sense of home. And so these conversations that I'm having with my kids, they probably, I mean, I keep stopping, you know, as we read together. I'm like, how do you think he's feeling? What do you think it feels like when Hagrid finds him and says, you belong at Hogwarts, you're a wizard, Harry. And so that that whole scene and the whole trajectory of Harry finding, I mean, he goes through a lot, and he carries a lot of weight. But at the same time, I think I don't know. I think kids need to have these conversations as well. The whole time that all of you were thinking, I was thinking a lot about our shared experiences having parents who are immigrants, and I know some of us on this panel also share this experience of the language that we are given at a very young age really shapes the way we think about who we are and the possibilities of who we are. And I know for my parents, they came and, you know, there wasn't a lot of focus on emotion and affect. And, you know, if I was really feeling sad, they were like, oh, just cheer up. You know, just focus on this. And so I had to learn, and it's not to blame at all, it's just a different generation and what their focus was. How do we start to provide a fuller lexicon for our kids around that emotional world that they live in and often don't have language for?
Well, we have a lot of questions coming in, so thank you all so much. It sparked a lot of reflection and emotion and thought. There's a lot of appreciation being shared for this day, for the opportunity to be together across space and to grapple with the complexity of these issues. One person shared that at their organization, when self-care or wellness is talked about, it's often in a way that is really about bypassing what's hard or painful. So you all's recognition of grief being part of the journey has really been valued. So let's dive in. To go back to you, Dr. Tao and Dr. Tomolanara. Dr. Tomolanara, you mentioned how resilience is often not thought of in the context of community or community definitions. It's framed more individually. And you also spoke in your talk about the importance of speaking truth. So can you speak to the place or importance of community storytelling, of stories in relation to building resilience? And Dr. Tao, you already started taking us there with Harry Potter. So would love to hear what either of you have in response to that.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think community storytelling is actually a beautiful way, and the community starts in the family often. But community could also mean schools. You know, one of the things that is missing so much, I think, and this people have been advocating for this in K through 12, is this, you know, to have multiple narratives, different stories that haven't been heard by everybody in a school community, that it's not just centered on particular stories of people from a particular racial or cultural background or religious background, right? But rather expanding those narratives, having multiple narratives being told. So, for example, in my Hindu community, mythology is actually how we communicate religious values to our kids. And so learning about the epics of the Ramayana or the Bhagavad Gita, that these are the scriptures have stories that illustrate what we actually believe in our philosophy. So the way that my children have learned about our religion is through these, since they were really little, stories, mythologies that where they can analyze these different characters, similar to this Harry Potter idea of what do you think was going on for this person and why did they make that kind of decision? And so having those conversations and storytelling, I think, is such a big part of most human traditions, most societies. So it's a beautiful way to develop a sense of community within a particular tradition or group, but also something to be shared more globally with each other and have that be entered into a sensibility that kind of pervades a society rather than keeping it in silos and segregated from each other.
Yeah, I love what you just said. That's all soaking in and thinking about how we're sort of born storytellers, and often we center the stories of folks that have all the vocabulary and the words. And kids, young children, are storytellers from very, very early age. They're telling us so many things about how they're experiencing the world, and not always. Someone had asked earlier around nonverbal sorts of ways we communicate nonverbally all the time. And I had an opportunity to work in an elementary school with 4th and 5th graders for a year and a half, where we went into their classrooms, and the focus was on how they understood themselves, their identities, and we asked them lots of questions, and they told us lots of things, and they taught us so much. This was right before the 2016 election, and the school in which I was working in, the 4th and 5th graders were predominantly Latinx 9 to 11-year-olds, and oh my goodness, the stories that they told, they were so prescient. And as adults, we tend to already have crystallized our ideas about the world, and it is, I really believe that it's, for any developmental folks out there, that it's around the 4th to 5th grade time where there is so much flexibility and malleability about how they imagine their futures and how folks imagine who they can be. It's just so much more wide and rich. And so I guess from what you had shared, how do we create collective narratives and really open spaces for different types of stories to be told, but then how can we also center the stories of youth, of children, because they're telling us so much, we have to listen. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so building on this idea of resiliency, Dr. Owen, you and Dr. Tao talked about the coexistence of flourishing and burnout, and I think several others of you mentioned that too, how this is not an either or. And this seems newer, to think about how these things may be kind of a both and. I can be kind of burnt out, but also flourishing in other moments. How does this relate to how we understand resiliency? And then to link it up with what you shared, Dr. Rambo, is there anything here that ties in with your idea from Howard Thurman of total regard?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me to think about flourishing is to think about it through a lens of moments of flourishing. And if you can start to think about your life as not just a state of some affect, but rather the moments that those are connected to, and reflect on those, and have some real strong self-compassion and appreciation for what's going well, I think it can go a long way. And in terms of like a community resiliency type of framework, then you can share some of those good things that are happening to you with other people. I always think through of like, at the end of my day, did I say thank you to somebody for something good that's happened in my day? Did I share that with them? And there's some days I can honestly answer, no, I didn't express any gratitude to anybody. I'm like, what a weird day that was. And so what am I doing for the community? Well, in that day, not much. But reflecting on that missed opportunity, I think gives me some chances to help be a better person the next day and show up in a different space and show up in a different way. And also, I also think that there's a lot of things that in flourishing that are trajectory building. So something that can happen really good in a certain moment of flourishing might have an impact right now, but it might also just set you on a different path moving forward. It's kind of like, I guess, what NASA did with that rocket, right? If you just hit it once and it moves the rocket off course and it won't hit Earth, that's a good thing. And so what are those things that are setting your trajectory in the positive direction in a, you know, a very fulfilled life?
I can say a couple things. I'm trying to, do I want to think with Howard Thurman on this? Probably, yes. I think the invitation is to think about how you notice your everyday movements. That resilience is not a kind of abstract concept, but that paying attention to how you move in your day and what you're paying attention to or not. And I do think that there's something about maybe the concept that I think he demonstrated throughout his writings was conviviality. Like, you don't have to have deep love and affection, but just a kind of friendly neighborliness is good for your health. That he would say that, right? That cultivating just practices of friendly everyday encounters really can boost you in ways that protect against isolation, a sense of maybe having to go into workspaces that are toxic, right? So you just buoy up these other areas in which there may be friendliness, just kind regard. So I think total regard often seems like, wow, where can I be in that space of total regard? And for him, he's like, you know, you're just looking for it everywhere, you know, little slivers of it everywhere. And I do think boosting it, awareness boosts the energy. He saw the connection between the kind of energy level, the neurobiology. He was really a forerunner in some of that stuff. So he'd just say, you know, where's the friendly factor in your day? Where are the moments that give you energy, and notice those and go back there. Do that again. So I don't know what that means for resilience, but it seems more tangible to me.
I just want to jump in. I really like this, and it's reminding me of something you said earlier this morning, which is about sniffing it out. And I'm a very visceral person, so I literally do sniff things out. But I also liked, so you talked about chocolate, and like once you taste the chocolate, then you can always know, you can imagine it right away. And so in psychotherapy, we call this the corrective emotional experience, which if you, especially within a therapeutic relationship, if you've never experienced trust before, if you've never experienced being able to really express anger before, and in the space where you feel total regard, all of a sudden you've learned something new, and I really like that I can be angry, or I really like that I can trust someone. And then from that moment on, it's a template that the next time I want to find trust, I had that experience with my therapist, so I know what it smells like, feels like, tastes like, and I'm gonna go find it again. And it's a real conscientious sort of practice, because you have to do it again and again and again and again. So anyway, I wanted to just highlight that. Really stuck with me. Yeah.
And follow up on that, Dr. Tao. The participants are linking together Howard Thurman's idea of total regard with what you shared with us today about cultural fortitude. Do you see an overlap there?
We need to write something together. So much overlap. Go for it.
Yeah. There's definitely, when Shelley was speaking, I was like taking notes, like, yes, yes. You know, I just felt like it was just really aligning with a lot of ideas that I have about cultural fortitude and just a lot of just the general sort of positions of teaching and the therapy that I'm really hoping to embody. And I just asked Shelley over the break, I'm like, which are the books that I need to start with? And I want to talk to you more. So yeah, so many pieces around there. Can you remind me the conditions? You call that the conditions?
The conditioning ground.
Conditioning ground. Oh my gosh, the conditioning ground. That's just such a gem for me to think about. It's a lot of it is it's 99%. Like we got to practice so many times. Like with cultural fortitude and calling people in. Loretta Ross talks about it's like it's all an experiment. All of this is all an experiment. Human beings are all an experiment. We're gonna try something 99 times, and it's like that 100th time that it lands. But we got to keep trying because we got to modify and reassess, and so I really loved that piece.
Thank you so much. Okay, so our conference topic today has been around living in a shattered world. And there's a number of questions coming up around polarization and how to navigate that. So anyone can feel free to jump in. Folks are naming the real forces that are pulling apart our country and our world, and grappling with how do we as care providers not take sides in times of political division, when we're facing climate impacts, war, threatened democracy, the pandemic. How do we ride these whitewater rapids? Big question.
Jesse?
Well played. I guess I could start this as with the question in itself. I think sometimes we can lean into actually challenging and not staying neutral. I don't think the way that I think about psychotherapy, at least, is it's never neutral. And it's a relationship, and you have values, client has values, and they may be similar, they may be different. But if you come from a stance of cultural humility, of not demonizing the other person, but understanding that those beliefs come from somewhere, they come from memories, they come from shared experiences, potentially with family or community, and just to get a chance to get to know what those experiences are, and have a conversation. Because if you do care about somebody, then it's a conversation, like Karen was mentioning before, of like, if you really do care and calling people in to have those conversations, it can be pretty powerful and uplifting. I think there's extremes, of course, and I think that's where our minds kind of jump to. And when I teach, one of my students will always say, well, what happens if you have somebody from the Ku Klux Klan that's in your office? And I was like, how many Klans folks are showing up to therapy? I'm not sure, but there's probably some people with different ideologies that might support white supremacy, and that's a conversation. And so I do think that there is very, very far extremes, and I've seen it and I've experienced it. And I also think that where most of us can live is in engaging conversations with folks.
Can I hop in here with some Howard Thurman? And it connects to something that Karen was mentioning about reading Adrienne Marie Brown. So people who are thinking very creatively about social transformation, largely artists. So just the ability to exercise the capacity to imagine the world differently, that's a discipline. It's a spiritual discipline. And Thurman will say there are real walls between A and B, right? For him, whatever those walls are, for him it was black and white, right? At a time of segregation, there are real walls between black and white. And his challenge was there's got to be a third way that between these dichotomies, binaries, and that for him it was the capacity to imagine a wall as a wall. That's very deep if you think with that the walls are real and not real, but the not real is the religious or spiritual imagination that the walls are created by segregated societies, but that the who we really are is together, united, one. So the capacity to imagine a wall as a wall, and we can take down that wall. So that to me was the invitation. Who helps us do that? Artists, science fiction writers, right? Fiction writers, Adrienne Marie Brown, other people who are doing that work of like, we've got to imagine different futures. This is also a lot of stuff going on in climate change and response to ecological trauma. But that seems to be like, I want to make a plug for imagination.
Platform 9.5. In Harry Potter, you walk right through the wall.
And perhaps what I would add is by connecting this conversation about resilience to our previous conversation about grief. You know, I'm not sure if a lot of the cultures here in America are good at grieving. We lack a language of grief, and that perhaps that's one of the reasons why we engage in so much bypassing or spiritual bypassing, where we can't hold the negative emotions, we can't approach the problems that we're facing in front of us, and therefore we will kind of bypass it all and kind of endorse some sort of toxic, positivity, and with a spiritual veneer of many shades and colors. And grief is going to be multifaceted when we're talking about a lot of these issues that our society and our country is facing. Perhaps part of the grief will relate to, hey, there are going to be situations where no matter what I say or do, it's not going to heal the grief. It's not going to heal the polarization. A lot of times we hold out this fantasy that if we do the perfect thing, we land the perfect intervention, that it's just going to magically heal everything, and that's just not the case. And I think some of that also has to do with grieving our own limitations, and I think that's so important for religious leaders and therapists that we're not all powerful, and sometimes we can't fix something, even no matter how hard we try. And related to bypassing, I think when we aren't able to grieve, we aren't able to cope very well, and thus we can't be resilient, because you can't grieve over. I mean, you can't cope for an emotion that you haven't accepted that you have in the first place. So, if I am actually angry, but I'm still struggling in la la land, wondering if I should be angry or not, I'm not at a place where I'm actually actively coping with my anger, right? So I first need to accept what's happening inside me, what's happening outside of me, before we can actually take steps towards doing something helpful.
Yeah, I think that a couple of you also raised this orientation, that question, that there's so much anxiety that can feed into the polarization. I was with a group of faith leaders some time back who were talking about the problems of polarization in their congregations, and it was a predominantly white group of faith leaders, and understandably they found themselves in a very difficult position. If one of my clients doesn't like me as a therapist, I can probably fill the seat next week. There's such a demand. But if a faith leader takes a stance that people in the congregation don't like, there's sometimes no-win situations, and as you pointed out, Dave. So I can kind of understand and it was good for me as a psychologist, making my living as I do, to sit and listen to the complexity of their vocational context, right? And as the hours passed talking about this, I observed that it was a predominantly white group that hadn't really talked about racism. And so there was a desire to somehow navigate polarization, but it started to feel like in the group that was bypassing certain really difficult issues. right? And so I think this is a great set of questions to reflect on. What are ways of dealing with polarization that, as many of you said, build capacities to deal with anxiety, to deal with difficult issues, and still respect people? And what are efforts to try to deal with polarization that are kind of minimizing difference or trying for leaders, sometimes for kind of understandable reasons in a certain sense, although for those of us who are white doing that, we have to be suspect of our motives. But trying to stay in this neutral ground. And I think those are very different stances towards the problem of polarization, right? One is fixated on avoidance, and one is trying to build capacity to deal with them.
And Dr. Sandage, that really links up with some discussion around racial healing as an existential or spiritual practice, that the work for white folks has to do with healing from racial superiority in unique ways, and the work for BIPOC folks involves healing from racial oppression. And layers of identity only complicate that. So any comments or reactions to weaving in this focus on racial healing?
I was actually thinking, as Dave and Steve were talking, that there are ways in which racially marginalized groups are kind of told implicitly and explicitly, like, okay, be over it, it's done now, slavery's over, or genocide is over, or this, you chose to come here as an immigrant, all kinds of reasonings around why we should be over it. And I think it is a problem that we have with grief, as Dave is pointing out. There's a really interesting piece of writing by Robert Stolorow, who's a psychoanalyst in the Los Angeles area. And one of the things he writes about is traumatic grief. And I'm paraphrasing what he said around this, but he basically spoke about how asking someone to stop grieving is like asking them to stop loving, and in this case, it's like stop loving yourself. Mm-hmm. Don't take care of yourself, stop talking about it. It's too hard for me to take in. And I was thinking about this in relation to a previous question around burnout, actually, and like, how are we burnt out? Can we not listen and actually take in other people's grief, and thinking about how we conceptualize vicarious trauma. Sometimes we think about it in our literature like we have to get rid of it and we have to move away from that. And there are other folks, though, that like Ghislaine Boulanger, who would argue that, in fact, we have to stay in it, in order to really be active witnesses to what's happening for someone. And we actually gain something from that process, that we're not just getting burnt out, and it's very distinct from burnout in that way. So when I think about racial healing, these processes seem really central. I think it's part of the themes that are coming out today, too, around grief and healing.
I just have one moment or example from the trauma responsive congregations work that I'm doing. We have this incredible advisor who's working with us in San Diego, and she was observing that there was this, strong message coming through in religious leaders of burnout, right? Indications of burnout, but also the theologies of kind of self-sacrifice and emptying oneself, and that there wasn't any like replenishment language going on in the theology. So this was, of course, of interest. And she just said really plainly, my religious community celebrates. We just celebrate. We don't have many resources. We have traditions. I mean, we are probably, would be considered marginalized, right? We're a marginalized BIPOC religious community, but we know how to celebrate. And that's might reflect the different racial, a kind of white Protestant sacrificial theology that is not helping our ministers.
Right.
But it's not everybody's experiencing burnout like that. There may be exhaustion, and that means the celebration index goes up like a lot. So just taking that musing from from the advisor who's like, yeah, this is really reflective of like white Protestant churches, but my community's got nothing, and they're celebrating to counterbalance some of the stuff. So just wanted to offer that.
There's a real validation in folks' discussion of how deeply meaningful it is to be able to name that the systems we work in can be traumatizing to us as we're trying to provide care. And someone pointed out the importance of reflecting on perhaps less obvious red pen moments, Dr. Sandage, to go back to your talk, structural elements that may be normalized within the field, like really high caseloads, low financial compensation, working longer hours. And so this is a big question we're not going to answer fully today, but the question is being raised of how do we reckon with some of this and hold hope for change when so much of it is structural. And we don't want to leave the systems in which we work because we care deeply about the work.
Yeah, I'm glad people are asking that and wondering about it. It is a huge set of questions. I mean, that in some ways is a big part of what this project that sponsored the conference is about. Is not so much that we, I don't suspect any of us on the panel feel like we've got this figured out, but I believe all of us probably think these are important questions that we need to explore and try to understand and make sense of contexts where helping professionals are thriving and ones where they're not. And to reckon with, as has been named, often early career people in any of these fields are probably in some of the toughest contexts with some of the most difficult workloads and sometimes the least support. And that's not a good equation. And I think, frankly, there's good reason to be concerned about whether what is happening in a lot of contexts is even sustainable under the current circumstances. So I hope that we can make progress in trying to understand these issues before other existential mental health realities impinge further. I don't know what you all think, but I also have a hypothesis that there's probably better care, I don't know if this seems too radical, better care offered by people that have good well-being. I mean, so I wonder if there are some win-win possibilities if we could get the right stakeholders looking into this and trying to grapple with it instead of just resting on what people are willing to sign up for and do. But I don't know what others of you might think about that.
I think when I hear this question, I think about when people think about structural aspects of either working environment, if it's the hospital setting, if it's insurance, to shift the mind frame of thinking of it as a system and think about people. And so like when I think about systems of power, oppression, and privilege, if you change that conversation to what's your relationship with power as if it's a person sitting in front of you, it changes the way you could potentially relate to it. And I think in some ways, if you think about the building structure of any given building that you walk into and do your work, that's the structure, right? But there's people that are navigating these spaces, and so trying to get curious about why they're doing what they're doing, right? So if my boss punches me in my arm every single day and it hurts, I'm going to start to ask, like, why are you punching me every single day? That's not nice, right? And so, but that's the workplace that sometimes we walk into where it feels like we're getting punched in the arm. And so thinking about it as a relationship and how your relationship with those folks in different kind of situations of power is really the key to moving the meter, right? So if we all identify a thing and start questioning what's in front of us, I think it moves the conversation within any given company who has pretty much set norms or set ways of doing things, and it changes those workplace conversations. So, like, for instance, like, why do we do 50-minute therapy sessions? Well, there's no research really that supports that it should be 50, right? Why do we do the certain things that we do, and just start to question on a daily basis what you're doing, and have those conversations with folks to see what they're thinking about. Does this structure work?
I guess one of the limitations we should accept is on this day, so we're coming to the end of the day.